All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening for our vernal pools webinar. My name is Mariah Byers, and I'm the chair of Long Reach Cares, and we're co-hosting tonight's event with Harper's Choice Cares. So we also have Katie Kirk and Chris Hipple here from Harper's Choice Cares. If Katie and Chris, you want to just say a quick hello?
Yeah.
Hello.
Chris. Yeah. Hi, I'm Katie Kirk. Nice to meet you guys virtually. Thank you, Mark, for doing this again.
Sure, very happy to do it. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Katie and Chris. And yes, thank you, Mark. We're so excited to have you present this evening and to hopefully next month do some in-person exploration of these vernal pools. So Mark is a local ecologist and he's going to be talking to us this evening. So Mark, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Always happy to have a new faces and some old faces to talk about vernal pools. It's a really important topic to me, and I think it's one that more and more people are aware of, caring about, and doing things about. So hopefully after today, that'll be even more so. Usually when I'm in person, I ask how many people have heard of vernal pools before the event, and used to be I got just a few straggler hands. Now I'm getting about a 50% set of hands when I do this. So things are getting better and better. So I'll start off with the title, which is Vernal Pools as Backyard Ecosystems. And I like to frame the topic in that way because a lot of people think you've got to go to a national park or some wilderness area or whatever to see, ecosystems in actions. But really, these are all over the landscape and accessible to everyone, and but still mostly overlooked. So we'll talk about them in that vein. You'll see that I also have Diana Devers and Jorge Barrantes Montero listed. I have some of their slides in here, and Diana, I believe, will be on the call, and she'll take over some slides for Patapsco Heritage Greenway when we get to that part of the presentation. You'll see in the bottom left, Vernal Pool Partners, which is a nonprofit I created to advocate for the protection, restoration, education of vernal pools. It includes 18 organizations, and you'll hear more about that later. So let's start off with the basics. Vernal pools by any other name. I mean, typically people will say they understand that vernal is Latin for spring, and that explains it because spring is when things really happen. But they really are just these temporary or ephemeral spring ponds, pools, seasonal pools, semi-permanent, woodland, whatever you call it, geographically isolated. Those are all characteristics and can be called by these names. Vernal pools, I like the best. It's got the most history, and I think it just has the most cachet. But there's other places out there. Seasonal water pools is a term that I found. So I'm in Guatemala in this picture. I was just there visiting, going to Tikal and some of the other ruins throughout the Yucatan and the Mayan history there. And lo and behold, they had a sign talking about La Aguada, which was their vernal pools that they were calling a seasonal water pool right there. And so all over the world they occur. So this, I think, is the most illustrative figure that really explains what's different about them, because you can think of it, well, there's a bunch of water on the ground there and what's going on. It becomes a vernal pool when it is ephemeral or temporary. And it can change from year to year as to whether it's got water all year long or not at all. But typically, you have at least 2 months of water, standing water in this depression. And you see that it typically works with the filling up in the fall, having its greatest depth over the winter and in the spring when the action happens. And then over the spring and summer, it will dry up. And that's because temperatures obviously increase, the vegetation begins sucking water out of the ground, and it just disappears. And because of that hydrological cycle, you have no fish. And that is the key factor with vernal pools, because the presence of fish eating organisms, especially the eggs and larvae, mean that these certain species cannot survive in wetlands, waterways with fish. So not having the fish populations means that you have species that can live in vernal pools and actually require vernal pools to complete their life cycle. They also, obviously, the animals have to be adapted to the fact that it dries, and a lot of aquatic animals can't do that, which means either that they have to have eggs or cysts that resist drying, which many invertebrates do, but more obviously, amphibians do what, right? They live in the land and the water. So if they can get their aquatic life stage completed in those 2 months to 8 months, then they can spend the rest of their time when it's dry out on the landscape. And there are many different kinds of wetland plants that are also associated with vernal pools. Some of them are rare. No, the biota is really what it's all about from my point of view. I really think it's fascinating to know what's in these small, often small, sometimes larger ecosystems. A lot of invertebrates. The fairy shrimp are one of the iconic species because they're obligate. They only occur in vernal pools. There's other kinds of shrimps. There's cladocerans, isopods, amphipods, copepods. Many of your insect larvae are present there as well as other kinds of invertebrates. But again, the big stars are the frogs, toads, and mole salamanders. Mole salamanders, obviously, by their name, means that they spend a lot of time underground. And actually, they spend 90% of their time underground as adults, but come to breed in vernal pools. So they couldn't complete their breeding cycle, and their larvae couldn't survive and mature if they didn't have vernal pools. There are also, in addition to those obligate species, many facultative species, which of course means species that use the habitat but don't require it for their life cycle. And my favorite is the spotted turtle here. Really cute guys, and the only ones I've ever seen have actually been associated with vernal pools. Here's another figure that I think is really useful to sort of understand how the ecosystem works. And these are those obligate vertebrates, which are the salamanders and the frogs. And you can see how, depending on the species, they have a different time that they'll show up to breed. In the warmer areas, sometimes in February. So when you'll get our first, this is the mid-Atlantic that I've got this figure from. There's a good report called Seasonal Pools of the Mid-Atlantic. And so the very earliest ones will be the wood frogs. Many of you may know that wood frogs can freeze solid. That's why they're the most northern distributed amphibian. But so they come out really early. First it warms up enough, 40 degrees or so, and some rains. They come out, and then of course they will breed and they will lay their eggs over a couple months period, and then they'll have the larval period, and then they'll have the metamorph period when they come out from there. You can just see how these things vary. So when we do our field work, our field trip next month, hopefully we'll be able to find some wood frogs, and if we're super lucky, maybe some spotted salamanders who are breeding or at least have left their eggs that we can see in the vernal pools. You can see all the species here. There's a number of mole salamanders. The ones around here are typically the spotted salamander, and there are also marble salamanders, which are interesting. If you look at those lines, you'll say, well, marble salamanders are already there. What's going on? They actually lay their eggs in the fall. So they're laying their eggs where there isn't any water, but they know the water is going to be there. So it's really fascinating that they will put their eggs in a moist, under a log or somewhere in the leaf litter, and then it will fill up, and then they will hatch out early, and they will have a head start competitively and predatorily on other organisms that arrive in the spring. And the eastern tiger salamander, you can see listed there, is an endangered species on the eastern shore of Maryland. Jefferson salamander, I've seen in Montgomery County. I have not seen blue spotted or maybes. They're not around in mole salamanders, I don't believe, are in Maryland. Okay, so that's what vernal pools have that make them really unique and fun. But let's talk a little bit more about what is entailed when you say vernal pool. In this part of the world, and there's vernal pools around the world, in California, they're often in open grassland areas, but here they're in a woodland context almost exclusively. And we talk about 3 life zones, and these are, again, a little bit arbitrary, but there's the depression itself, which is where the standing water is. But then there's also an area around it that is affected, that affects the water quality, the drainage, and so forth, and where most of them, again, the marble salamanders will lay their eggs, and there'll be a lot of juveniles. But we think of that as about a 100-foot radius. So it's important to have a woodland area around the pool to provide that habitat need. And then really, I guess I mentioned before, the adults will span out and spend their time underground. So they might go out 1,000 feet or so forth. So about 95% of a population will be within 1,000 feet of that vernal pool area. So those are all important habitats to preserve. And here's what it looks like, right? And oftentimes you can imagine if you're in the woods, you're walking along, you sort of see a wet thing, you don't really know what's going on there. But it can be a very important habitat. And you can certainly see why some people don't even recognize that they're there. And certainly when they dry, it looks just like the forest. Okay, so I've just figured, so Jorge is with the Anacostia Watershed Society, and he's done a lot of monitoring for several years down there with his colleagues. And so they have some cool pictures of critters that come right here from Maryland. So I thought I would throw those into the presentation. Jorge and Diana and Rachel and others that I work with have done presentations over the years. Here we are. So just a couple examples, just so you have a good visual picture of what vernal pools look like. This is a farm pond pool. And if you think about vernal pools, how do they get created? The natural landscape changes over time, tree tip-ups, various erosive factors, but also human activity. Farm ponds are created, roadways are created, and so forth, can create vernal pools, just like a natural meander might be cut off from a stream and become isolated as a vernal pool itself. So the one on the left is an old farm pond, and the one on the right is a swale, where water just runs, but only keeps it wet for part of the year, thereby keeping permanent fish populations away. Here's some of the critters. Again, you can see that there's a variety of species that you'll see there. These are various tadpoles. The spring peepers are very early, and they'll show up in these. They can occur in other wetlands, so they're not obligate, but they are facultative. Green frogs as well. And they're probably the two most common frogs that you'll see in Howard County. Here's some of your microcrustaceans. They hadn't found any fairy shrimp in their ponds yet, but you can see that's a whole variety of fascinating looking animals if you have yourself a microscope. Mollusks of various kinds, different kinds of snails and so forth. These are all things that he documented in vernal pools in the Anacostia watershed, including tube worms, naiad worms, etc. This is from the farm pond picture you saw before. Again, just quite a variety of things going on. Dragonfly larvae are a big player, various other kinds of really fascinating invertebrates. And there they are from the swale pond. So some different things. Crayfish also can occur in vernal pools. And there are different kinds of vernal pools. I mean, it's a very simple definition, and they function the same way no matter what vegetation is associated with them. But we are in the area around Washington, D.C., the only place that magnolia bogs occur, which is sort of a kind of vernal pool, which is Sweet Bay magnolia dominated. And so they have one in his Anacostia watershed monitoring area. So let's talk about threats. Hopefully everyone's thinking, well, these are really, really cool, and they're in the landscape and they're all around. And what's the history? And so the history is that they're under threat, just as many natural habitats are. You can certainly imagine that, especially during the dry period, that no one's going to even notice they're there. They come in to do some grading, build something, or whatever, they're removed. Once you flatten it out and they're not there anymore, or you put a grade so that it drains, any of those kinds of things will destroy the hydrology and you lose your vernal pool. If you remove all the woodland habitat, of course, then they can't keep out that life cycle. And the upper left, the sad story there is salt. We know, I think many more people are aware that the salting of roads and the oversalting of roads is a real problem for our freshwater systems, because salt does not degrade or transform. It's always in the streams, it's always in the groundwater. And so if it gets into a vernal pool, it can be deadly for the organisms there. Various other kinds of pollution and climate change, of course, changing the precipitation regime and the drying thing can mean that we can lose vernal pools that way as well. So hopefully you're convinced that vernal pools are important and that there's things going on that are not good for vernal pools, so that we would do what we can to keep them going. And so I thought I'd just focus on these various reasons we should care. And the first one is ecological services for species. I think hopefully I've made the case that, they're, like I say, important breeding habitat for amphibians, and they are obligate or critical, necessary habitat for those species like the wood frog and mole salamanders. They support the aquatic and terrestrial food web. The way I like to think of it is, all these different organisms use them. They occur all over the place, so it provides an oasis or a stepping stone in the landscape for these organisms. The rusty blackbird, for those of you that are birders, really like vernal pools, and they're in steep decline. So they're critical for a wide variety of species and supporting the biodiversity of the landscapes across Maryland and in Howard County. But they also provide ecological services for people. As any part of the landscape that collects water and filters it through the ground, they remove pollution, they replenish groundwater. They provide natural mosquito control. That's always a question that I get, what about the mosquitoes? And mosquitoes will show up there, but then they will be eaten by the predators. Having a mature community at a vernal pool does not provide habitat for mosquito populations. So all the mosquitoes you see, if you have a vernal pool, I have one in my backyard, but the mosquitoes come from other things, from tarps and toys and buckets and stuff like that. The vernal pools have the predators, and there's actually been a lot of monitoring and studies to that effect, that when you have a mature vernal pool, there's not a mosquito problem there. And perhaps most importantly, they provide a connection to nature. We all know how important that is for mental health, physical health, and they're nearby and visible once you look for them. And I think that's an important thing in today's time. So I mentioned quality of life and the connection to people. I think that they bring a new richness of life that you can appreciate in a very nearby and an easy way. I call them the true backyard ecosystem. Some other people call them singing forests. I mean, you think about the fact that, one of the best things about spring is all of a sudden you begin to hear birds sing, you hear frog calls. Vernal pools are often the site of the frog calls. And that really, brings spring to folks and helps them move out of their winter malaise. And as I mentioned before, they have pollution and groundwater benefits. And last, if not least, it's the right thing to do to protect biodiversity, and vernal pools are part of that. So the question then becomes, what can you do as an individual? And first of all, I always say that, and maybe there are some people on this call that didn't know what a vernal pool was before today, and now they do, and that's great. So hopefully you'll understand them better, because if you don't understand something, you're not going to care about it. So I think the more that you know, the more you do care. I'll have a few references here. You can look things up in the future, and I'm always happy to talk about vernal pools or give you more information if necessary. They exist nearby, so go out and enjoy them. Don't tromp around in them. We don't want to create disturbances, and we don't want to carry any diseases from one pond to another. So if you do go and you're going in with your boots, then your boots should be sanitized with some bleach, so that works well. But typically, just enjoy them from the edge, and do your part to protect them. How can we protect vernal pools? How can we have more of them in the landscape? They can be created because they're simple and they have just a few requirements. We can actually create vernal pools. We can inventory them to find out where they are, so we can understand better how to manage them, what's going on in the landscape. And we can preserve them through legislation, which I'll talk again in a few minutes. So here's an example of creating. I assume a number of you have been to the Howard County Conservancy, where I'm on the board. And what we did a few years ago was to get a grant from the Chesapeake Bay Trust and have a vernal pool created. You can see, if you just go down the hill from the Nature Center, right near the on your way to Hodgepodge Lodge, you'll see this area, and it was a nice area for collecting water, and we just did a little digging to provide enough space for the water to fill up, and you can see where it is on those maps. And here it is beforehand. You can see in the upper left, that's my wife, 5'4", so you get a feeling for the size there. And then some equipment came in. Ecotone was contracted to dig out to a layer of clay that was impermeable. I didn't really mention this, but if you're going to hold water for part of the year, you need to have an impermeable layer of soil. When you create them, you can do it with a liner, but ideally you just have impermeable clay. So they dug down to that level there, and you can see my wife looking at it saying, oh, here's some water collecting. And you can see after that, not long after, with rains, water did collect. So we sited it in a good place, and it's very accessible for the community at the Conservancy. There's a kiosk there. There's additional educational materials being developed for that. So that's one way to do it. And this is also some vegetation that we put, some wetland plants around it. You can see the kiosk there. This was done by Howard EcoWorks. And you can go even simpler than that. You don't necessarily need earth-moving equipment. This is my backyard, and what we have there is just a plastic shell, 2 feet by 4 feet. And you'd say, well, if it's plastic, it's never going to dry out, or it might dry out. It doesn't dry out, but it still acts as a vernal pool because there are no fish in it. And that's the key factor. Some years I'll drain the whole thing out. Some years I won't, but it doesn't have a fish, so it acts as a vernal pool. And 5 years after it was put in, wood frogs arrived, which I sort of thought would happen, but I wasn't sure. And to my pretty significant surprise, 8 years after it was installed, spotted salamanders showed up because I live about a kilometer from the Columbia Mall. So I'm not out in the woods anywhere, but I do have woods behind my house that is part of the protected forest conservation area of my development. And there was enough old trees and old um, underground habitat for these guys to be there. So you can see this female, and you can see the eggs that I have in my hand there, and they were right there. And so they continue to lay. I've not found any larvae yet, but they continue to lay their eggs each year in our vernal pool in my backyard. So Diana, are you on the call?
Yes, I am.
And is Diana able? Well, I guess you can change. I can do the slides. You can do the slides. I don't know. But
Say
Diana
go for it.
Deaver is the environmental director at Patapsco Heritage Greenway, which is a great group. But of course, I am biased because I'm also on the board there. Patapsco's done a lot of great work and continues to do so. And I thought I'd let her talk a little bit about, again, these are what you can do. You can build them like we just talked about, or you can do inventories and education. And Patapsco Heritage Greenway, or as we call it, PHG, is leading the way on that. So go ahead, Diana.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. I'm really excited to be able to talk about vernal pools because we're just getting into the season. And we're actually going to be leading some hikes soon. So I was just going to talk a bit about what we do for Patapsco Heritage Greenway and kind of how we mold into our community involvement for it. So the two main ways that we focus for vernal pools is we do vernal pool guided hikes, where not only do we lead the hike, and that's usually just me, and then we also talk about vernal pool identifiers. So how could you as a person go out and kind of look for one? And then we also have a vernal pool inventory. So we're going to also on the hike talk about how do you then take that data that you have and be able to put it into our survey and then linking different things. So just like how Mark had talked about that one of the vernal pools had salt inundation in it, we do our salt watch test in there. We talk about possible pollutants that could come into it. So that way we all kind of link those environmental things all together at once. Go for it, Mark, to switch the slide, because I'll talk a lot about the fun. So my background that I even have here is actually what the Trolley Trail vernal pool looked like last spring when I did our vernal pool hike. The main two areas that for our vernal pool hikes we'll be going to this year is the Trolley Trail out in Owella, and we'll be right by the Trolley Stop restaurant. That is on March 8th. And then we'll also be at the McGill Commons down that way that I learned with Mark this last spring as well. So we're going to go there and look at the vernal pools there. That's on March 29th. All of them are on patapsco.org. So if you go there and go to our current events, you can register there. And then that way you can take a hike with me. So the pictures that you're seeing right now are what our Trolley Trail actual vernal pools look like. And they have some wood frog eggs in them, which is pretty exciting for us. And I have seen wood frogs there for almost now 5 years that I've worked for PHG, which has been pretty exciting. It's also exciting because if you look on Google Maps for the Trolley Trail, these vernal pools are there often enough that they show up on Google Maps. They actually sit there as 5 linking vernal pools right along for where Cooper Branch comes in. So some things that we're doing when you see these pictures are, one, you see us gathered on that part of the trail. That's where we're along the side and we're talking about how do we identify some vernal pools. So we're going to talk about those things. Then in kind of the next picture in the middle, here's where, just like how Mark had said, we're staying along the edge of that area. None of us are tromping into the vernal pool. We're mainly just staying around the edge, looking to see what we can find, seeing what stage it's in. Mark was great and was able to bring some containers so we could take out some wood frog eggs and actually see what they look like. And then as you can see, they'd lay in these masses. We talk about different animals that could lay, what those different eggs look like, whether they're singular, do they look more like grapes, do they look like a big ball? And then the last picture is me and my coworker, Mandy, who's our water quality manager. So she runs our water quality program. And so she was able to talk about how vernal pools are another really big resource for us in the water quality world. It gives us a good link to everything, especially because they're ephemeral. So go for it, Mark. So on this thing for the hike, we're also going to be looking at, well, I know those vernal pools show up every year. We also take time to look around to see, did any new vernal pools get created? And some of those things that we're looking for is this pit and mound topography. So a big one is you're looking for like big trees that fell over. And already this winter, I've seen a few of them along the Trolley Trail, because I do like to about mid-February, just take little jaunts places and be like, where do I think a vernal pool is going to show up? and live that. So we're looking for that pit and mound. You're looking for something that fell over, that pit that's underneath. And then we're also looking for, as it gets warmer, these, indicator species. So listening, looking for the different way those eggs are formed, those kinds of things. We're going to talk about how we're looking for those depressions, talking about, we're looking for kind of maybe near a water source, but making sure it's not linked directly with that water source, which for Maryland, because we have a lot of water, it's very easy to think that something's a vernal pool, but it's actually being fed by maybe a smaller stream all the time. And just maybe that smaller stream, it's an offshoot. So we kind of talk about those things and we're able to look for it. But the main thing is, even if you're not 100% sure, we want you to put in that data that we have. And so for the next slide, show you guys what that data looks like. So we began this kind of pilot year in March of 2021, and this is where our kind of community science aspect came into it. So on patapsco.org, we have our vernal pool in our community science section. That's our vernal pool survey. So in that survey itself, that's where we're looking at what kind of data do we want people to collect. And so after looking at what Jorge does and what Rachel Gauza does, they're more, I would say, in these different levels. So Rachel Gauza's work is working with naturalists through the Park Service, and they're really dedicated into what their scientific method is. Then Jorge's working with our master naturalists, and again, working through this very distinct. So we at PhD kind of looked around and said, well, we have a lot of community members that are really interested in this, but maybe we don't have the time to do the training, but they really want to be a part of this science movement. So we said, okay, let's find out a way to do community science. How do we get people just involved that when you're going on your regular hike through the park, through your own backyard, how do you kind of decide if this is a vernal pool or not? So then just like how it has in the photo next to here, it has our vernal pool inventory on our website. We talk about, here's the data we want to collect. And then on the hike itself, we have data cards that we all fill out together. So we can also decide, what do those things look like together? So we all get the same visual aspect of that as well. So some of that data is like, what's the canopy cover looking like? What was the temperature that day? What do we think the water level is? And we talk about how do we then measure those things where maybe we don't have a bunch of tools. Could you measure it by, oh, I put a stick into the middle of the water. This is how high the water went up. And I'm going to guesstimate that it's about a foot deep because I know that my foot is a foot. And so that's how deep it was. So we're asking a lot more of like, you don't have to have all the tools. We're trying not to make it scary. We want people to just understand what that looks like. And then we want you to guess and take a bunch of pictures too, because then me and my coworkers can go out there and be like, oh no, we think this is a really good vernal pool. And then we send it off to people like Mark, Rachel, and Jorge. Be like, I think this is a really good vernal pool. We should really take a look at it. And those are the things that are helpful for us. And you learn all of that on the hike with us. So that way it doesn't look as maybe scary from the beginning. So again, those are on our website for patapsco.org. You can feel free to join those at any time. It's really exciting. We basically just ask you for some information, your date, all of that jazz. And some of the kind of extra ones that we usually ask people, especially because it's Maryland, is did we have rainfall or precipitation recently? So is this really a vernal pool, or is it just we just had a massive rainstorm, happens to be a depression, and that created a large puddle, and that's where it's going to be. So things like that help us. And especially now as it's getting warmer a bit for this week until we have, some Monday snow/rain put together, you get some different information. But it's exciting, and it's been exciting to learn more and more from Mark, especially as we get more involved in the Vernal Pool Partnership. So thanks so much for allowing me to talk tonight, and feel free, if you have any questions, you can always go to the website and I can help you out.
Thank you, Diana. That's great. Appreciate it. You did much better than if I had to cover those slides. Thank you.
No problem.
So hopefully you learned a lot already about vernal pools. And here's some other resources out there. I mentioned before the Introduction to Mid-Atlantic Seasonal Pools, which I was involved in putting together with Robin Young, who was at USGS at the time. There's some other great investigators. Colburn in the Northeast. Maine has done a lot of work. A guy named Tom Biebighauser is the expert on creating these things. He's been doing it for 20, 30 years. He came once to Wheaton Park, and we built one there. So it's an interesting to read his guide on that. Henry Wilbur was one of my doctoral professors, and he did a great review of just how these organisms work in these life cycles of vernal pools. And for those that really want to get down and identify larval and eggs, there's a nice source there from Parmalee et al. At this point, again, we're still talking about what you can do, right? So we talked about getting educated, experiencing them, doing some inventories to help out PHG and others, and create them if you have the opportunity, but also protect them via legislation. So this is very timely today because just the last 2 weeks we had our hearings in the Maryland General Assembly for a bill called the Vernal Pool Protection Act of 2026. It's our third year putting this forward. We have a sponsor in the House, Terry Hill, my delegate here for those of you in West Columbia, and Senator Mary Washington from Baltimore City and Baltimore County. And so those are our sponsors. We had our hearings. Jen Terraza, also from Howard County, and Chow Wu, also from Howard County. So again, some of our other local legislators should be given kudos for supporting this legislation. Just to give you a quick history on it, I guess we've still got about 10 minutes or so before questions. And so this is a picture from our first year. And you can see Mandy that was shown before, our water quality director for PHG, and Eli Vogel from Audubon, myself, and Delegate Hill testifying in front of the House committee. And those, some of our vernal pool partner, there's actually 18, there's more than that we have, but you can see Chesapeake Bay Foundation, the Nature Conservancy, National Aquarium, Audubon, all these folks are all really promoting and supporting this legislation. What happened the first year was the education year, the way we talk about it, those of us that work on legislation, to get people to understand what this is about. We got MDE to prepare a consistent definition. And then we came back and began to work with MDE over the last 2 years to develop language that would work. As you may know, there's a budget crisis and the agencies are underfunded, so it's tough for them to take on new responsibilities. So we've made it as easy as possible for them. And this year, this is the definition of vernal pool. I don't think we have to go into that, but you can sort of see that it's scientifically valid, involves expert opinion. So we have that. And so this is what our current Vernal Pool Protection Act has. So we're focusing on what we call qualified vernal pools, as some states in the Northeast do. All the states from Pennsylvania to Maine do something to protect vernal pools. But the qualified ones are the ones that support obligate species that we talked about today, the amphibians and the invertebrates, as well as a buffer around them to protect, again, the rest of their life cycle. So we would create a list of those vernal pools that MDE would then review when they have a permit for a development. So in other words, as that list grows, there will be more vernal pools on there. So it's pretty straightforward. They just have to check their GPS system and their list to see if there's vernal pools to protect them. But the idea is that vernal pools deserve the same amount of protection as other non-tidal wetlands, which are protected in Maryland. They are not protected federally. You may well know that the Sackett versus CPA decision and everything that the current administration has done has been to remove protections for our waterways. Vernal pools have zero federal protection because of their isolated nature. So if you want to do something to help out and pass this legislation, we've got the bills. Again, they're in the General Assembly right now, and this is session. Session goes to April. MDE, if you want to send an email to either Jeremy Baker or Lee Curry at MDE and say you think this bills are really important, please feel free to do so. If you want to send an email to the chair or vice chair of the House Committee on Environment and Transportation, Chairman Corman and Vice Chair Guyton, that would be helpful because right now they're considering whether to provide what they call a favorable report, which means that they would vote it out to the full House or the full Senate. And ultimately, if those pass, then they would go to the governor to sign. And on the Senate side, it's Chair Feldman and Vice Chair Kagan. And we just had this hearing yesterday. Time flies, right? Again, the hearings went well. We have good hopes. It comes down to MDE agreeing that they can do that, and we are currently waiting for them to get language that we can all agree on. Actually, Chair Corman said to MDE, who was in the room, work this out with the delegate. So we're just trying to get to the point where they agree that they have the resources to do it. And with that, I'm just going to have 2 more slides. And this one here is one I'm going to read. It's Robert Frost. I just thought it was apropos of the spring coming. Spring pools. These pools that, in forests, still reflect the total sky almost without defect. And like the flowers beside them, chill and shiver, will like the flowers beside them soon be gone. And yet not out by any brook or river, but up by roots to bring dark foliage on. The trees that have it in their pent-up buds to darken nature and be summer woods, let them think twice before they use their powers to blot out and drink up and sweep away these flowery waters and these watery flowers from snow that melted only yesterday. So reading that, you might not know it's about vernal pools, but it is. Here's my last slide. Again, just emphasizing the fact that these things are just outside. You find them, and we'll plan to have hopefully a daytime and a nighttime walk and talk when the critters are out, hopefully. So I'm going to play this guy. And March is coming, and the weather hopefully is warming. And once we get 40-degree rains at night, we should be seeing these wood frogs and maybe even spotted salamanders coming to our vernal pools. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you, Mark.
Sure.
And that is just, I can't get over that you had a spotted salamander in your very own backyard. That is just so cool.
If you were here when that happened, my wife and our niece who was staying with us, were cooking breakfast, and I just went out to just check, and when I came back in, I was pretty excited. You might imagine.
I bet.
Any questions? Was this the first time for anybody learning about vernal pools, or did everybody sort of know about them? I'm curious. Usually when we're in person, I can answer, see hands raised and answer questions, but any comments or questions from folks?
I'll just make a comment. This was my first time learning about them. I mean, I think I've heard about them before, but I didn't know anything about them. And I also did not know you could make your own. I think that's super
Pretty
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing that you made that in your backyard and
they showed up. I mean, you never know if they're going to
really
show
amazing.
up. Again, like I said, I'm only a kilometer from the Columbia Mall, so I'm not like out in the woods, but there are trees around, and some old trees, so that's good. What I like to tell people, and I've talked with Howard EcoWorks, I think probably a lot of folks on this call are proponents of bioretention, rain gardens, and those kinds of things to reduce our impact of stormwater. And people, if you want to put one in your yard, what do you do first? You go to see if you have good infiltration to get that water down into the ground, which means if you don't have good infiltration, you can have a vernal pool. So either, your yard should work for one or the other. It depends on your soil. But so keep that in mind.
We've got a couple questions in the chat, Mark.
Sure.
Someone asked if the ponds in Blandair North/East are vernal pools.
I need to go. I need to look. I mean, I've been to Blandair a few times, but I've never seen vernal pools. So again, they could be created, they could be natural, but they can function. It depends on the landscape situation as to what critters might be around there. But yeah, I would be. The key factor is not having any fish, and as Diana pointed out, sometimes you'll see what appears to be an isolated body of water, but it has regular connection to a stream where fish get in there and eat up stuff. So it just depends on that. But yeah, they're all over, and some of them are more productive than others. Again, the ones with the most connection to natural wooded habitat are the most productive.
Those ponds are on the undeveloped side of Blandair.
Okay.
Mansion is. There are a couple ponds. One might be a water retention, so that probably would make it not a vernal pool, but then there's another I don't think is connected that way. But I'm not sure.
Okay, so that's on the north side, across from all the development. Okay. I would suspect that there could very well be, and they could either be, natural processes or even remnants of land use, which still they may function very well if they've been around for a while. And they should be on a list somewhere, right? So that way we don't put a kiosk or a building or a road or something and remove them. So yeah, if you know where they are, actually put them on Diana's list. Even though it's not in the Patapsco, we'll take it. We'll put it on our list.
Debbie Goldstein asked, what is the difference between vernal pools and non-tidal wetlands?
Okay, so wetlands is the typical word used for things, waterways or waters of the U.S. that are not streams, rivers, or ponds or lakes. And so wetlands are swamps and marshes and include vernal pools. So scientifically, they are a non-tidal wetland. Where it gets interesting is that the way things are regulated are by rules, right? And so a non-tidal wetland is defined in Maryland as a wetland that meets 3 criteria from the Federal Manual of Delineation. And so as long as we maintain that manual, and if the manual goes away under the current administration, which they would like to do, they would have to institute the same criteria for our state. But it basically says you have to have the hydrology that I described. You have to have water that comes there on a regular basis. You have to have hydric soils. That means soils that are wet, basically. And then you have to have hydrophytic vegetation, which means plants adapted for water. The tricky part comes in. So those are wetlands, non-tidal wetlands. And if they're not in the tidal zone, then they're non-tidal. And you can imagine that marshes are typically tidal, swamps and other wetlands are non-tidal. Vernal pools, if they meet those 3 criteria, which some do, then they are non-tidal wetlands, and they actually are already protected by Maryland law, although because they're dry, oftentimes they're missed. They're not seen. There are many, many, many vernal pools, and we don't know the proportions that don't meet those 3 criteria because many have no vegetation at all. I mean, it's just leaf litter on the ground. And, so their soils, depending on the drying cycle, may not be that hydric. So what we want to do with our legislation and what we think we should do with our advocacy is protect those other vernal pools that don't qualify as non-tidal wetlands. So you can see that it's not a short answer, but hopefully it's a clear answer.
And then another question we have in the chat, does regular connection also refer to an overflow from a huge rain event that causes a stream to go out of banks?
So as all ecosystems are dynamic, so are vernal pools. So things can vary. I mean, and again, it's the absence of fish that is the key factor. So it could be a vernal pool, but some years water comes in there. If it doesn't create a permanent fish population, then it's still going to function that same way. If you were to get fish in there and it was to stay wet for a long period of time, the fish might survive. But again, if that's an irregular thing, it probably won't affect the functioning of the vernal pool because the fish won't be able to survive long term. So just because it gets water flushed into it from a high rainstorm, don't discount it.
Any other questions for Mark? And while you're thinking, I'll mention that once we have a better idea of when we'll do look at those vernal pools over in Harper's Choice, I can send an email out to all the registrants this evening. So hopefully you can attend that as well.
And guys, also, Diana, when is your
when we're doing our hikes, we're doing March 8th. So both are Sundays. So it's Sunday, March 8th. And that's the trolley trail one out in Owella. That's right behind the trolley stop restaurant. And then March 29th is the one out by McGill Commons.
So guys, people have a lot of options. Those are already set. And then we're going to try and play the weather with the other one here in Harper's Choice and see if we can find stuff going on. So hopefully somebody, and it's going to be sort of monitoring it. I've made a couple of questions. Deb Capacity lives nearby, and she works for MD, and she said she would look herself. And so other people will look. Just let me know, and we'll get this thing scheduled once we've realized that there's some activity there.
Great.
Any more questions, comments? And thank everybody for showing up, showing an interest, and anybody wants to get more involved, contact me. Mark at vernalpoolpartners.org is one way to do it.
Thank you guys so much. Thanks for hosting this, Mariah and Long Reach Cares. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mark and Diana. So great to have you here this evening, and thank you everyone for attending.
Get
ready
excited.
For spring.
Vernal pool season.
Yep.
This is time. Perfect time. Yep.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.